The desert stretched for miles, endless and ancient, a sea of gold and bone beneath a sky that hadn't seen mercy in years. The sun hung low, dull and swollen, bleeding light across the land like an old wound that refused to close. Wind crawled slow between the rocks, carrying the taste of dust and silence, the kind that settles deep in a man's chest until even his heart forgets how to echo. A lone rider moved across that stillness, a figure half swallowed by the horizon, where sky met earth and both seemed tired of the meeting. His coat was the color of the land, his hat pulled low to guard against the sun and whatever memories it burned awake. The horse beneath him breathed heavy, its hide shimmering with sweat, each step sounding like a heartbeat buried too deep in the quiet. To the east, the ruins of an old church stood crooked in the sand, its roof gone, its cross leaning like it was praying for rain. A coyote slipped through the shadows there, ribs showing, eyes bright with hunger that wasn't just for food. The man watched it for a moment, then looked away. He knew hunger of a different kind, the kind that ate years, not flesh. Behind him, the trail was barely a scar. Before him, nothing but more of the same. The land didn't care if he lived or died, and he liked it that way. The desert didn't ask questions, it only kept secrets. That's why he came here. Once, he had a name that mattered. Once, he had a home that didn't echo when he breathed. But out here, names were like smoke, they rose, they vanished, and the wind never remembered them. A storm was building somewhere far off, a faint bruise in the horizon, rolling closer. He could smell the coming rain, thick with dust and thunder, the kind that didn't just fall, it cleansed. He pulled his horse to a stop on a ridge overlooking a dry riverbed. The bones of cattle lay scattered below, pale against the red earth. He stared at them like a man looking into a mirror. The wind shifted, soft, uncertain, and carried something faint and human. Not the cry of an animal. Not the whisper of ghosts. A sound that didn't belong to the dead. He straightened in the saddle, hand drifting to the rifle at his side. The storm kept crawling closer, shadows spilling like ink across the land. Something was waiting in that silence. Something the desert hadn't buried deep enough. And for the first time in a long while, he felt the ache of being alive. He found her where the storm had broken the land open, down in the dry riverbed, half buried beneath the sand and the ragged limbs of a fallen mesquite tree. The rain had come hard and sudden, carving channels through the earth like veins of sorrow. When it passed, silence returned, heavy and clean, except for the slow, uneven sound of her breathing. He thought at first she was dead. Her skin was the color of dust and sun, her hair tangled with grit and thorns. But when he crouched beside her, the smallest tremor in her chest gave her away, faint, defiant, alive. He didn't speak. There wasn't anything words could do here. He brushed the sand from her face with the back of his glove, rough leather meeting softer skin. A bruise shadowed her temple. Her wrists were bound in old rope, frayed from struggle. Whoever left her here hadn't cared whether the desert finished what they started. He cut the ropes with his knife, slow and careful, the blade catching what little light the storm had left behind. When the last strand snapped, her fingers twitched, a weak reach toward something she couldn't see. He caught her hand before it fell. "Easy," he murmured, voice cracked from disuse, more air than sound. She didn't answer, but her breathing steadied, shallow, trusting by instinct more than choice. He fetched his canteen and held it to her lips. The first drop spilled down her chin, then she drank, eyes still closed. The sound of it, small, desperate gulps, was louder than the wind. When she coughed, he steadied her head against his arm. There was a mark around her neck, faint but cruel, like a collar once worn too long. He didn't look at it again. Some things didn't need questions. The horse waited above the ridge, uneasy, nostrils flaring at the scent of blood and storm. He lifted her slow, cradling her against his chest, and the weight of her, light as a secret, pressed against his ribs until he could feel the rhythm of her heart beating against his own. The climb back up took time. The mud slid under his boots, the sky flashing silver and gold in distant anger. By the time he reached the top, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of iron and sorrow. He laid her across the saddle and covered her with his duster, tucking it close around her shoulders. Then he climbed up behind her, one arm steady around her to keep her from falling. For the first time in years, he wasn't riding away from something. He was carrying it. He turned the horse west, toward the line of black hills where his cabin slept under the weight of the wind. The desert watched them go, unblinking, unjudging. And somewhere behind them, thunder rolled again, like the land itself exhaling. The cabin stood alone at the foot of the black hills, a crooked frame of pine and memory, held together by nails older than either of them. When he carried her inside, the air smelled of ash, leather, and rain-soaked wood. The fire in the hearth had long gone cold, so he built a new one, slow, methodical, the way men do when silence is the only company they trust. She slept for a day and a night. He stayed near, mending tack by the window, listening to the desert breathe through the cracks. Every now and then, she stirred, the faint rustle of fabric, the murmur of a dream, but she never called out. When she woke, she looked at him like she was still deciding whether the world was finished with cruelty. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask for his. On the second morning, he left a bowl of broth by her side, venison and wild onion, still steaming. She waited until he stepped outside before tasting it, her hands trembling too much to lift the spoon steady. When he came back, the bowl was empty. Neither of them mentioned it, but something had shifted, a single thread of trust woven through the quiet. Days passed. He worked the land, repaired the corral, gathered kindling from the dry creek bed. She began to move around the cabin, slower than the light, always watching, always ready to vanish if the world blinked wrong. He never got too close, but he left signs, small, wordless offerings, a folded blanket, a mended boot, a canteen filled fresh each morning. At dusk, when the wind turned colder, she'd sit near the hearth while he sharpened tools by the fire. The sound of steel on stone filled the silence, a rhythm steady enough to soothe, not threaten. She would sometimes glance at the knife, then at him, then back to the flame, testing the difference between danger and warmth. One evening, the lamp went out. The flame died too quick, leaving the cabin swallowed in dark. She froze, breath caught sharp in her throat. He struck a match, slow, deliberate, and cupped the flame in his hand before lighting it again. The light touched her face, soft and trembling. He said quietly, "Ain't much use bein' afraid of dark out here. It never leaves for long." It wasn't comfort, but it was kindness, and in this place, that was rarer. Later, when he went to check the horses, he found his duster folded neatly by the door. It still carried the faint scent of her, wild sage and smoke. Inside, she watched the fire breathe against the walls, its glow moving across the room like a living thing. For the first time, she let her shoulders rest. Outside, the wind howled across the hills, but inside, silence had changed its tone. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. The nights grew longer as autumn crawled across the desert, bringing with it a kind of stillness that made every sound feel too loud, the crack of the fire, the creak of wood, the quiet breath of someone trying not to remember. He sat by the table one evening, oiling his rifle under lamplight, when she came in from the dark. The shawl she wore was the same one he'd found wrapped around her the night of the storm, torn, sun-faded, and stitched in places with sinew and patience. She moved like a ghost that had chosen, at last, to be seen. Without a word, she set something on the table between them. A necklace, a single turquoise stone strung on rawhide, its surface cracked from years of wear. He looked at it, then at her. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. "It was my mother's," she said finally, voice thin as wind over bone. "They took her before the harvest. I buried what was left." Her eyes stayed on the fire, the reflection flickering like memory itself was burning away. He didn't ask who they were. The world had too many names for men who took what wasn't theirs. After a long silence, he set the rifle aside and rolled up his sleeve. The light caught a scar that ran from wrist to elbow, jagged, pale against sun-dark skin. She looked at it, then at him, question unspoken. "Shiloh," he said quietly. Cannon fire caught the line. "I was one of the few that walked out." The word hung heavy in the air, not a place anymore, but a wound made of smoke and memory. He poured 2 cups of water and slid one toward her. For a moment, their hands brushed, rough against fragile, both marked by survival more than time. "I thought the desert would forget me," he said, staring into his cup. "Turns out, it remembers better than most men." She traced the turquoise with her thumb. "The land doesn't forget," she murmured. "It waits." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks toward the chimney. He looked up, studying her face in the shifting light, the faint scar beneath her jaw, the tired strength in her posture. She wasn't just surviving, she was enduring, the way stone endures wind. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a folded piece of cloth. Inside was a photograph, the edges cracked, faces faded, a woman with kind eyes, a little boy beside her, both looking towards something just out of frame. "She was my wife," he said. "And that was my boy." He didn't say what happened, but the silence filled in the rest: war, fever, loss. The same old story wearing a different name. She placed her hand over the photo, not to comfort, but to acknowledge. A shared understanding between 2 people who'd been reduced to ghosts and still managed to breathe. Outside, the wind had shifted again, soft and warm for the first time in months. Inside, the past finally had a place to rest, not forgiven, not forgotten, but seen. The peace broke on a morning that smelled of dust and iron. He was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard it, the faint jingle of spurs carried on the wind, steady and unhurried. Not a wanderer. Not a drifter. Men who came this far off the trail didn't come by accident. She was inside, grinding maize at the table, the sound rhythmic, fragile. When he looked through the doorway, she met his eyes, no words, just understanding. The kind born from too many years running from the same kind of silence. He set the axe down and reached for the rifle leaning against the post. The horsemen came into view, 3 of them, dust riding their coats, hats low, the glint of tin flashing on one man's chest. Lawmen. Or worse, men pretending to be. The one in front called out, voice slick as oil. "Morning, stranger. You seen an Apache woman come through this way? Escaped from Fort Lowell 2 weeks back. They say she slit a guard's throat." He didn't answer right away. The desert behind them shimmered with heat, the kind that made men impatient. "Can't say I have," he replied at last. His voice was calm, but the words tasted like ash. The man on the horse smirked. "Funny. Got word she was spotted near these hills. Thought maybe a lonely fella like you might have found her company worth the risk." The other 2 laughed, short, cruel sounds that didn't reach their eyes. Inside the cabin, she stood motionless beside the wall, a knife clenched in her hand, breath slow and measured. The turquoise around her neck gleamed faintly in the shadow. He felt the weight of choice pressing against his ribs, same as the night he left the battlefield, same as the day he buried his family. Men like him had lived by one rule: stay clear, stay alive. But as he looked at her silhouette in the window, fragile, fierce, human, he knew the desert had finally given him something worth breaking rules for. He stepped closer to the lead rider. "Ain't seen anyone but ghosts out here. You're welcome to ask them yourself." The man's grin faltered. "That so?" The air tightened. A hand twitched toward a holster. The wind stopped breathing. Then, a standoff's heartbeat, he leveled his rifle, not aiming, just making the line clear. "You're trespassing," he said. The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. The lawmen exchanged looks, weighing the cost of curiosity. Finally, the lead rider spat into the dust. "Desert's full of fools and bones." Guess we'll let it sort which you are. They turned, slow and deliberate, until the horizon swallowed them whole. Only when the last hoofbeat faded did he lower the rifle. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the knowing of what he'd just chosen. Inside, she set the knife down, her eyes shining with something between gratitude and grief. "They'll come back," she whispered. He nodded. "Then we'll be ready." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the sound of two lives no longer hiding, just standing still against the storm. The desert quieted again after the riders left, not in peace, but in the deep, trembling silence that follows danger when the heart still remembers the echo. Days passed, marked only by sunrise and the long exhale of twilight. The sky softened, the wind gentled. Even the land seemed to loosen its grip on them. He mended the fence one evening while she gathered mesquite branches for the fire. The air smelled of smoke and sage, the kind of scent that clings to memory. When she came back, her hands were streaked with dirt, a few splinters lodged in her fingers. He took her hand without asking. Sat her down on the porch steps and pulled a knife from his belt, not as a weapon, but as a tool. He worked the splinters free, one by one, careful as if touching something sacred. Neither spoke. The only sound was the rasp of the blade's tip and the hush of the wind threading through the dry grass. When he was done, he wrapped her fingers in a strip of cloth torn from his own sleeve. "You work too hard," he said quietly. Her eyes lifted to his, unreadable, soft with something that might have been forgiveness. "So do you." The sun was setting behind the hills, spilling gold over the land. The light touched the scars on his arm, the turquoise at her throat, old pain glinting like it had found new meaning in the same glow. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small object, a piece of cedar, smooth and warm from his palm. Carved into it was a tiny bird mid-flight, wings stretched wide. He set it in her hand. "Started it years ago," he said. "Never knew who it was for." She traced the carving, thumb resting over the wings. "Now it knows," she whispered. He smiled then, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the mouth, only softens the eyes. For a moment, the years fell away, and the world seemed smaller, quieter, almost kind. That night, the rain came again, light and steady, tapping against the roof like a heartbeat. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. She sat near it, mending his torn shirt with small, deliberate stitches. He watched her hands move, sure, calm, the same hands that once trembled at every sound. When she finished, she handed it back to him. Their fingers brushed, a single, quiet spark. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Instead, he reached out and touched her cheek, rough thumb against smooth skin, like testing the truth of her being there. She leaned into it, just enough to say what words could never carry. Outside, the storm softened to a whisper. Inside, two people who had come to the desert to forget had found, instead, the courage to remember. And in that shared silence, heavy, human, whole, the distance between them finally disappeared. Morning came slow across the desert, soft light spilling over the hills, brushing against the earth like forgiveness. The same land that once looked hollow now shimmered with life, green shoots pushing through the cracks, birds returning to sing to the silence. He stood by the corral, tightening the reins of his horse. She was beside him, her hair loose, swaying in the breeze that smelled of rain and mesquite smoke. Neither said anything, they didn't have to. The quiet between them was no longer the silence of strangers, it was the kind that holds meaning. Far to the east, the storm clouds were breaking apart, the last of them drifting away in silver threads. The ground still glistened with last night's rain, small puddles catching the morning sun, mirrors for a world learning how to begin again. She reached for the turquoise around her neck, then took it off and placed it in his hand. "The desert kept it long enough," she said. "Now it's yours to remember." He looked down at it, cracked, worn, beautiful because it had survived. Like her. Like him. He didn't try to speak. Words would have only broken the spell. Instead, he tied the necklace to the saddle horn, letting it catch the light as the wind shifted westward. Behind them, the cabin waited, smoke rising from its chimney, soft and steady. The kind of smoke that meant a fire still burned inside. She turned to him. "You still think this land forgets?" He smiled faintly. "No. It remembers what's worth keepin'." The wind moved between them, warm and alive, carrying the faint sound of laughter, hers first, then his, quiet and low, mingling with the rustle of the grass. For a long moment, they just stood there, two shadows against the widening light. Then he reached for her hand, rough palm folding over hers, and together they started down the trail toward the open plain. The desert stretched before them, endless as always, but it no longer looked empty. It looked like home. And though the wind still carried dust, now it carried their laughter too.